Great leaders don't just drive performance, they develop people. Well, today on Transformation Station, we're exploring how to unlock potential in others without pushing them into burnout and how sustainable growth becomes the measure of leadership. Come on, let's dive into this great conversation. Welcome back to Transformation Station, the podcast where leadership is shaped through clarity and resilience and transformation. I'm your host, Adrienne Benton, and today's episode speaks directly to leaders who want to grow strong teams, not exhausted ones. I'm super excited to talk with our guest today because our guest is actually one of my leadership mentors. Her name is Colonel Heather Cotoia, U.S. Marine Corps retired. She is a human resource leader and guru, and she will bring powerful insights today into what it means to develop people with intention, creating environments where growth is encouraged. She's going to talk with us about how excellence is supported and how high performance doesn't come, how you can allow high performance to not come at the cost of our well-being. This conversation is about leadership that builds capacity, not burnout. And it is my honor to welcome today. Welcome to Transformation Station. I'm so glad you're here with us today.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here, Adrienne. You are such a powerhouse. More people need to be out watching your station. Every time I watch the fantastic people that you have on there, but the tidbits that you give are just fantastic. So it's a constant, continuous learning, which is great. But thank you so much for allowing me to be here with you today.
Absolutely. It is my honor to host you, our honor to have you here. So Colonel Cotoia, what stands out to me as I have been reminiscing and remembering our time together in service, what stands out to me about your work is the way I have watched you help leaders understand that unlocking potential isn't about demanding more. Many times it's about creating the conditions where people can thrive. So I want to start off by asking you this question. Why do so many leaders struggle to unlock potential while at the same time still maintaining performance expectations?
That is a great question because, reality is that, many leaders were promoted because of the results they delivered, right? And their performance. And I know you just had a great piece about promotions and things like that not too long ago. Because, leaders aren't always taught the how to develop others, to unlock their potentials. We're in this busy world, leaders are under pressure, mission first, the bottom line, making money. And so leaders become managers of tasks instead of growing people. That challenge is that, performance and potential, they're not opposites, they're absolutely connected. When leaders, we like that word alignment, when leaders achieve alignment between that performance and the potential, they achieve that long-term capability and that capacity. So if leaders, if they only focus on the outcomes, they're going to get short-term results. They're going to get long-term disengagement. And so that leader needs to kind of come back and shift the focus, and that shift needs to become on capability and capacity. Leaders focusing on unlocking that potential through slowing down a little bit, but coaching, are you training them? Are you supporting them with the resources they need? Are you clarifying your expectations? And then are you trusting them to rise to those challenges? Individual growth, you're going to get that, but you're going to get it through a leader who has unlocked that potential because they've shifted that focus. from performance to capacity and capability and individual development, So I think that's why we struggle, is because sometimes we focus on the I instead of the we and the us,
That's powerful.
The old parable, right? You give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, but you teach him how to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. So if we grow them, we teach them, and we'll talk more on, about, how we can do that some more too. But I think that is key, is about you grow your people. That's how you'll unlock the potential.
Yeah, I love that. As a leader, many times we wrestle, or we find ourselves in between delivering results right now and developing people for the future, right? And so many times, because we are results focused or outcome driven, developing our people many times gets treated like it's this extra, as opposed to this is my leadership responsibility, right? And so that, I think, can be a tension. I've also seen this. Here's why this tension is so common: because short-term results crowd out long-term growth. Most organizations reward immediate output, right? So that goes back to everything that you just shared with us. So I want to ask you this question, right? How can we challenge our teams to grow without pressure that often leads to burnout?
That's a great question too, because we just talked about that pressure. That pressure can be overwhelming, and I'm sure we've all been in those situations. Some jobs are just more prone to that burnout, sales and recruiting and information technology, and those positions that are counselors and helping, crisis management, or first responders or things like that. But I think that, how you can is you have to build the resilience in yourself and your team, and how do you do that? You're going to do it through discipline and being a consistent leader and making clear expectations. And you take care of you and your team's basic needs, which is protecting their time. You have to know your team's strengths and weaknesses, and you have to know when you have to set boundaries, even if they're not capable of doing it sometimes. Sometimes it's that intrusive leadership,
Yes.
But growth is definitely challenged when expectations aren't clear or there's no support, and so what do strong leaders, we challenge people because we have to set the high standards, but we also have to remove the obstacles, So when we remove the obstacles, that helps remove some of the pressures, and that could be sometimes that obstacles are, higher leadership or adjacent departments, but also utilizing your position and influence properly to give your team the time and the space that they need. Because if you don't, they will burn out quickly. And I know from my own personal challenges that I've had, that was one of the things that, that I got feedback on, was I gave them space. I protected them from that layer, So how do we remove those obstacles? It is by prioritizing the work, saying no to some of those low value tasks. Don't be the yes man. I know a lot of us are like, we can do that. Our teams can do that. Or, and communication, you have to check in on that capacity. Just because you can, does it mean you should?
Say that again.
Yes, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And I know I've been guilty in that, but you ensure that routine communication with yourself, with your team, because they're only going to know you care when you show you care by being present and asking questions and then supporting them. And don't forget also to ensure that your team understands the why their work matters, how they fit into the big picture, knowing that they're feeling supported, because, challenges can become motivating instead of exhausting.
Mercy. This is like a very fruitful conversation right here. And to everybody that's listening and watching, here on Transformation Station, we'd like to take a moment to assess, to stop and reflect. And so I want to invite you to reflect. on what Colonel Cotoia is sharing with us. Like, these are leadership gems right here. And as you were talking, I was thinking about this. I'm going to put it up on the screen. Pair high expectations with high support. Challenge alone creates pressure. Challenge with support creates development. So, to our leaders, we invite you, one of the best practices, how can you pair having a high expectation of your people with a high element of support? I literally heard of someone today who was sharing that they were in a situation where there was a high expectation, but the support was very limited. High expectation, I expect that you're going to get this done. They were not trained on how to get it done. They were given limited resources, but they were expected to turn out this product that was high quality. And it was very frustrating for the individual. And so, to all of our leaders, how can you pair high expectation along with high support? Also, you talked about burnout a little bit, and I saw this, which says growth requires stretch, but burnout comes from stretch without support or recovery. And to every leader that's listening and watching right now, listen, many of us are working in high tempo fields and jobs, right? Where it's go, 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 go. It doesn't stop. However, we have the ability to stop. For me, I always start to recognize when I can't shut my mind off at night. When I'm just starting to think. And I say, oh, Adrian, wait a minute. This is a sign you got to take a training time out, right? Whether that is work is over, you go to the gym, you come home, you look at the phone. If it's not an emergency, you do not answer that phone. You don't respond back. You got to take some time for yourself to just be at peace, stop, and be still. And so, to all the leaders, we want to invite you to remember you are important and you model leadership. So it's important that you allow yourself some recovery and support time. So this leads me to this question. What role does trust and psychological safety, that's a big buzz phrase right now. What role does trust and psychological safety play in helping leaders perform at their best?
That is huge, because trust is the foundation of performance. Trust is the foundation of relationships. Trust is a performance multiplier.
Yes.
If there's no trust, people are going to play it safe. They're going to hide their problems until they become bigger issues. And then that's when bigger issues can lead to failure. And I want to share a tip, because sometimes in failure, it's hard to see, the forest beyond the trees, right? And I probably have that quote wrong, but you get the image I'm trying to say, is that we focus sometimes something right and internal instead of looking external to what we're trying to do. And I know you just did a little podcast here and talking about failure. And so if we're not in a trusting relationship, if we're not ensuring that we're enabling that trust climate in that environment where our people can, feel safe, they're, where they are willing to speak up, they're willing to ask questions, they're willing to admit mistakes, and even try new approaches, which lead to better outcomes for them and for you. But when if you don't have that trust, and you can have catastrophic failure, and you hope that doesn't happen. So what can I learn? I learn how to build that trust, put the time and effort to build, that environment, so that your people, it starts with you as a leader. Yes. You have to be consistent. You have to own your mistakes. You don't have to sit there and belabor and excuse it. You have to just own it, be authentic, and be genuine, and then show by your actions in the future that you meant what you said, and be consistent, and you actually owning that mistake and building their trust and keeping their trust. And sometimes listening to, the feedback that they provide you, not just when things are good, but sometimes when things are bad. It's a two-way street. We have to give and take. That communication is so important for that foundation of trust. and building that environment of safety where they are going to feel okay to, it's like enthusiasm is infectious. And when trust and things thrive, people, they will thrive and not just survive in a trusting relationship. They feel like they can take risks. They can, and how I think you build that is, I'm sure retired General Mattis, a great Marine general that we had. And I really love, is a leadership philosophy and a leadership tool. He always said, how do you, what should you be doing as a leader? And, it is really, it's in his book, Call Sign Chaos, but he really talks about, you have to listen, learn, help, and then lead. And it's true. How can you help somebody if you don't listen to what they need, learn what they need, and then help them, and then lead yourself? A lot of the times leaders will just go into a lead relationship or role, which sometimes there's necessary for that. But does that build that foundation of trust? Does it build, individuals who want to speak up and ask questions, who know that you are genuinely invested in them, in their develop, in their welfare, and their being, So trust and building that environment, a safety will absolutely is a, key tools to enabling people to be able to perform at their best.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What a thought provoking conversation that we're having right now. And so everyone, I want to invite you to really stop and take some assessments. Go ahead in the chat right now. Share with us, what are you gleaning? What is resonating with you in your leadership journey as you are watching or listening to this podcast? Please let us know. As you were talking, I was thinking about this. Trust and psychological safety are not soft leadership concepts. They are performance accelerators. Psychological safety is the belief that I can speak up, I can take risks, I can be honest without without being punished or humiliated. This is huge. Many teams, you will find dysfunction because they feel as though they don't have the space to be able to share their thoughts, share their opinions, to make mistakes. I don't know if anybody that's watching right now, if you've ever had a leader that you've observed or a leader that was leading you, where if someone made a mistake, it's like it was the ends of the world and everybody felt like they were walking on eggshells. That's not the culture that we want to have. We want to have psychological safety where your team is not afraid of having hard conversations, and they're not afraid of trying and missing the mark, trying, not getting it right, and learning what they can learn from that lesson as they move forward and enhance their skill sets. And then this last one, as we talk about trust, trust is the foundation of effective teams. When people trust their leader and each other, they communicate openly and they collaborate faster. I have seen that time and time again on various teams that I have been on. When there was a culture of trust, man, people shared ideas, right? They shared responsibility. There was no I, it was us, it was we. And they collaborated faster. Collaboration is the key many times, right? They say there's no I in team.
I think that's key. That just, I think, as we are in, boardrooms and, team things as we're working on a project, I think that quote right there on the screen, trust is the foundation of effective teams. When people trust their leader and each other, they communicate openly and collaborate faster. So if you had that kind of up on your wall as a kind of a mantra, how quickly, and maybe add in, with no retribution, no fear of retribution, because, that's why, sometimes, people, in my own experience, some of the hardest failure that I have had has been because of, people wanting you to not allow that honest feedback. And, I just want the yes men, the yes women to work for me. And how do you grow as a leader? How does the team grow if everybody's just telling you yes? And the emperor has no clothes on and nobody's telling him, So, we have to grow too. And I think that is an important key piece that you talk about, is that you have to be open. You have to build that, again, you have to build that trust to do that. I wanted to share, because I had forgotten to share, but when we were talking about, if there's no trust and people play it safe, and the, problems become hidden and they become bigger issues. And those bigger issues can lead to failure. There's a good quote that somebody had just on their podcast. Hint, hint, might be somebody I'm talking to. But faith is not the absence of failure. It is the refusal to let failure have the final word.
I see. Yes. Yes.
So it's a great one. And how does trust play into that? It's the foundation of having that trust in yourself, that to move through it, to move forward, to learn from it.
Yes.
So that you can get back to those, positive environments that, your team thrives instead of just survives.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That was like a masterclass right there. So that brings me to this question. How can leaders identify hidden strengths in their team members? How can we help to bring these hidden strengths forward in our team members?
Well, in my piece, I've always gotten kneecap to kneecap, or one-on-one, as you come in as a leader, I think you have to kind of understand who the person is. And that can be tricky navigating sometimes, the privacy laws and things, that you can have, but you can always remind people too that it's a voluntary basis, but you really get to know the person. What are their strengths and what are their weaknesses? And so you kind of have a basis of what their goals are, and piece like that. But I find in my experience that a lot of time that we as leaders identify those hidden strengths when we're sometimes on the outside, and it's in those moments outside of their formal job description, their authentic moments, and you're observing how someone solves a problem, or how somebody supports others, or they step up during the challenge. It's things outside of their normal job description, because we are pretty good about seeing those strengths and the things that, the tasks, responsibilities, their knowledge, skills, and abilities of what they do and how they achieve them. But then when you see how they do these things, that's, I think, sometimes when we as leaders can uncover these strengths. And it's by, asking sometimes just some good questions and observing their patterns and giving people stretch opportunities. We talked about that a little bit before, but, if you give them the stretch opportunities, they'll achieve them, and sometimes it's just simple as saying, hey, I noticed that you were really strong at, this today, have you ever thought about using that more? Or, like recognizing those opportunities that just kind of come up, and, hey, is there a goal, or something or some project that you would like to work on, or how about ask this question, hey, what can I do for you? How can I help you and bring you forward? Asking that question, but I think too, recognizing people and looking at those opportunities is often all it takes to untap and unlock that capability and those hidden strengths. Being a valued member of a team in the manner that supports them will help bring them forward, because you don't always get people that like public recognition. And sometimes it's just that little simple, hey, that handwritten personal note, or hey, that little $5 or $10 Starbucks gift card, and saying, thanks I saw what you did and I really appreciate it. Thanks for being a team member. It's those kinds of opportunities that we as leaders can help them, bring them forward.
Yeah, sometimes we think that it's more difficult than it actually is. You mentioned something earlier. I think it takes intentionality as a leader, and one of the things that I thought about when you were talking is this, we can provide feedback that names strength. Many people don't recognize their own strengths because no one has named them. As a leader, we can say something like, "This is something you do exceptionally well." What a difference it would make, when you have your leader that says something like that to you. It causes you to say, they see me, she sees me.
Yeah.
Wow, right? What a difference it makes. And so to every leader, we want to invite you to find ways that you can identify the hidden strengths of your team members. It means that you, as Colonel Katoya was saying, you got to be intentional, right? You have to stay aware that intrusive leadership, and also you have to be willing to acknowledge and recognize. So, ma'am, as we turn the corner on this conversation, I want to ask you one final question. If a leader wanted to develop just one person more intentionally this week, where should they start?
Start with the conversation. Listen and learn, and maybe it's not that conversation, that they had right at that moment. Maybe it was last week's conversation. Maybe it was that initial, onboarding conversation, or that annual, appraisal as they're putting their input for them. But ask, sometimes it goes back to something. Ask the person what motivates them. What's their goals? What do they want to learn?
Yes.
Where do they feel underutilized? And I talked about before, is there a project that, want to be a part of? Hey, I really saw that your skills are really great and strong in this,
Mm.
Hey, would you be willing to, work on this project that, hey, we have coming up, But so you listen, you learn about them, and then I think you help. So connect them with that opportunity, connect them with an assignment, connect them with exposure or a responsibility that aligns with both their goals and the team's needs. You build growth, you build trust, and intentional development. It doesn't have to be complex. It just has to be personal, and it has to be consistent. I think key ingredients as a leader are being authentic and genuine. And when you're intentional in your development, in the presence and clarity and just support that you provide them, I think that, that's how you can build them in just 1 week, how you could just start.
Yes, I love this. This has truly been a very calm, quiet masterclass full of rich gems. And to everyone's watching, I know if you're like me, you need to go back and watch this on the replay and take some notes that we can actually commit and execute to right away. And I'm going to put you on the spot and just ask, please, if you could just say one final word of encouragement to that leader that is listening or watching right now that's saying, man, I want to be this type of leader that they're talking about, but I feel stuck. How would you encourage them?
I would say reflection. Can you, as a leader, you have to look at how you lead, because we can see how we lead and by how our team kind of reacts to things too. So if you want to become that leader, it's got to be intentional. You have to have the growth mindset. You have to be willing to change, and you have to be willing to trust the process. I would say sometimes we can't do that on our own. So sometimes it's seeking out a mentor, seeking out a peer mentor, seeking out, a coach.
Yes.
So I think it's important that you've got to reflect and have that humility to make some space and just quiet time to reflect. And that's hard to do, but maybe that's when you're going on your walk, when you're going on your run, or you're doing a hobby, or, you're driving to and from work or something like that. But I think how you change is you have to realize that you need to change. You got to be willing to change. And then you have to have a plan and an action to do it. And how can you be successful is having those mentors, having those coaches that can help you, achieve that success. So, team, it's all about the team. All of us are so much better when we're surround ourselves with a team, but It is about reflection, humility, and then moving forward with intention.
Absolutely. This has been wonderful. I want to thank you so much for sharing these precious gems of leadership with us, for sharing your wisdom and your experience. It has been an honor to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being here. All my best.
Absolutely. Thank you. Wow. What an amazing conversation that we had today. I have to remind you that the opinions and views expressed here belong solely to the authors and do not necessarily reflect those of the DLW or its components. Any mention of commercial products or services do not imply Department of War endorsement. Additionally, the presence of external hyperlinks do not signify Department of War approval of the linked websites or their content, products, and services. Today's conversation truly reminded me that the goal isn't just to build high performing teams, it's to build healthy, capable, and resilient people within those teams. And if this episode resonated, I'm going to invite you right now to choose one person that you lead and ask yourself, what would help them grow without carrying more than they can sustain? Be sure to subscribe to Transformation Station. Share this episode with a leader committed to growing people well. And remember, until next time, the best leaders don't burn people out to get results, they build people up to sustain them.